Reports from committees. Prime Minister's questions.
Member for Couva South.
Thank you very much, Mr. Deputy Speaker. In light of the decision of the government to cancel the US $71.7 million contract between China and, forgive my Mandarin, Deputy Speaker, Jesuba Group International Engineering Company and the Housing Development Corporation, can the Acting Prime Minister inform this House of all penalties accruing to the government and or HDC arising out of the said cancellation?
Honourable Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. I'm advised that the HDC and the China Gezhuba Group International Engineering Company are currently in discussions in an effort to arrive at a mutually satisfactory resolution to the contract. As a result, there are no penalties accruing at this time.
Until Couva South.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. Can the Acting Prime Minister inform this House whether an advance payment or sum was issued on this contract over $500 million to the taxpayers of Trinidad and Tobago?
Mr. Acting Prime Minister.
Just 1 second. Mr. Deputy Speaker, I'm advised by the Minister of Housing that no advance payment was paid.
Supplemental, Couva South.
The Acting Prime Minister confirm that the framework agreement for this $500 million contract was signed in July of 2018 by the then Minister of Housing, who at the time was the Prime Minister of Trinidad and Tobago, Dr. Keith Rowley.
Acting Prime Minister.
Mr. Deputy Speaker, I'm not privy to those details.
Couva South, supplemental.
Supplementary question.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. Can the Acting Prime Minister state whether this contract for over $500 million was vetted by the Attorney General of Trinidad and Tobago?
I will not entertain that question at this time, member. Supplemental, member for Pointe-a-Pierre.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. To the Acting Prime Minister, based on his first response of the penalties at this point not being accruing, could the Acting Prime Minister state in the contract what would that penalty be if no proper, no positive negotiations have been concluded?
Acting Prime Minister.
Mr. Deputy Speaker, I'm not privy to those details at this time.
Member for Couva South, final supplemental.
Can the Acting Prime Minister inform this House whether this contract for over $500 million was approved by the Cabinet of Trinidad and Tobago?
Acting Prime Minister.
Mr. Deputy Speaker, the framework agreement was approved by the Cabinet.
Member for Couva South, question number 2.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. Given that 16,523 Venezuelan nationals were registered through the government's registration and migration process, can the Acting Prime Minister inform this House as to the number of persons who have formally received their registration cards to legally work in this country for 1 year?
Acting Prime Minister.
Mr. Deputy Speaker, I'm advised that cards are processed upon verification of identity and background checks from Interpol. I'm told that 5,148 applications in total have been verified by the Venezuelan authorities and Interpol and local authorities and have been recommended for ministerial approval. So far, I am advised that 3,091 cards have been processed and printed, and the relevant applicants have been contacted to collect them.
Supplemental member for Couva South.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. Given the data which have been provided by the Acting Prime Minister, could the Acting Prime Minister inform this House whether the figure that he has given, if any of these individuals have found to be foul of the law by Interpol and other law enforcement agencies?
Acting Prime Minister.
Mr. Deputy Speaker, I've been advised that out of the total number that was registered, so far, 112 have been found to have criminal records ranging from robbery, larceny, drug trafficking, and homicide.
Supplemental for Caroni East.
Could the Honourable Acting Prime Minister indicate whether he or in conjunction with the Minister of Health have done any or have adopted any procedures with regard to the early detection of communicable diseases arising from the presence of these Venezuelans in Trinidad and Tobago?
Member, I would not entertain that question at this time. Supplemental Couva South.
Thank you very much, Mr. Deputy Speaker. To the Acting Prime Minister, given the 112 individuals who you have informed this House have found to be or were found to be afoul of the law, could you provide this House with the information as to their current status, whether they are in Trinidad and Tobago or have they been repatriated to Venezuela?
Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. As you know, Prime Minister's questions come at a very short time before the sitting. This is the information given to me by the Ministry of National Security, and I would advise the member to pose that as a direct question to the Minister of National Security, who I'm sure will be able to provide the detailed particulars that are being asked now as a supplemental question.
Question number 3, member for Pointe-a-Pierre.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. Can the Acting Prime Minister state the specific terms and conditions of employment of Ms. Arlene Chow as Interim CEO of Heritage Petroleum Limited, inclusive of all prerequisites and allowances?
Honourable Acting Prime Minister.
Thank you. I'm not sure what a prerequisite has to do with a compensation package, but I'm advised by the Ministry of Energy that the base salary for Ms. Chow in her interim appointment as the Chief Executive Officer of Heritage Petroleum Limited, the base salary is 150,000 Trinidad and Tobago dollars per month. The interim CEO is provided with a company vehicle and a driver and has a cell phone monthly limit of 1,000 Trinidad and Tobago dollars per month. The term of employment commenced on the 1st of September, and these terms will remain in effect for a period no less than 6 months.
Supplemental member for Pointe-a-Pierre.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. To the Acting Prime Minister, based on your response, could you also state if Mr. Wiley, who is the substantive CEO of Heritage Petroleum Limited, is still being compensated by Heritage Petroleum Limited as we speak?
I will not entertain that question at this time. Supplemental member for Kumutu Manzalina.
Can the Honourable Minister indicate what process was used for the hiring of Ms. Chow?
Acting Prime Minister.
Thank you very much, Mr. Deputy Speaker. I also would like to inform that I'm advised that the terms of engagement can be terminated by either party with 1 month's notice in writing. Ms. Chow, who from her curriculum vitae. Mr. Deputy Speaker, I'm being disturbed by members to the right of me. Ms. Chow, from the curriculum vitae, her CV that was published in newspapers, has 40 years experience in the energy industry and has served in many senior positions. Mr. Deputy Speaker, I'm still being disturbed by members to my right. Has served in many positions in the energy sector, including Chief Operating Officer of Atlantic LNG, which at one time was the largest LNG processing facility in the world. Has also served in senior positions in BP Alaska and also in Petrotrin. Ms. Chow has come forward at a time when someone with that sort of experience, record, and academic training was required and has agreed to serve. And as a result, Ms. Chow was selected by the Ministry of Energy and by Heritage Petroleum because of her qualifications and tremendous experience and track record. And I wish to thank, yes, and I wish to thank Ms. Chow coming forward in a situation where an unforeseen event could have resulted in severe trauma to the National Oil Company of Trinidad and Tobago. In an emergency, I want to thank Ms. Chow for her patriotism, for coming forward to assist the country.
Yeah, member for Point of View.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. To the Acting Prime Minister, based on what you just described about Ms. Chow, are there plans to confirm her as the CEO of Heritage Petroleum Limited?
Acting Prime Minister.
Mr. Deputy Speaker, I'm advised that Ms. Chow has agreed to serve for a period of 6 months, and it is the intention of Heritage Petroleum, I am being advised by the board and chairman, that is the intention of the Heritage Petroleum Company to do an active worldwide search for a permanent CEO who would serve in due course.
Supplemental member for Couva South.
Thank you, Prime Minister. Prime Minister, could you inform this House whether at the end of Mrs. Chow's tenure, she will be paid a gratuity payment?
I will not entertain that question. Question number 4, member for Point of View.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. To the Acting Prime Minister, given the appointment of a 10-member committee by the government to evaluate bids for the sale of the Guacara refinery, which was to be completed by August 31st, 2019, can the Acting Prime Minister state if this committee has determined a buyer for the sale and/or lease of Guacara refinery, and what are some of the key terms and conditions governing the arrangement with this new buyer?
Acting Prime Minister.
The committee has not yet determined a buyer.
Supplemental member for Point of View.
Could the Acting Prime Minister state how longer would the committee be reaching a decision and reporting back to Cabinet?
Acting Prime Minister.
Mr. Deputy Speaker, the committee's mandate is to make recommendations to Cabinet, and barring unforeseen circumstances, the government expects to receive these recommendations within the next week.
Question number 5, member for Naparima.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. Can the Acting Prime Minister state whether any due diligence by the Office of the Attorney General was undertaken prior to the signing of the framework agreement between China Jesuba Group International Engineering Company and the Housing Development Corporation on July 30, 2018?
Acting Prime Minister.
Mr. Deputy Speaker, I'm advised that the framework agreement did not require the Attorney General to give an opinion on the contract.
Supplemental member for Naparima.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. Is it the norm for state enterprises to enter into contracts in the order of this magnitude without reference to oversight by either Cabinet or the Attorney General?
Acting Prime Minister.
Thank you very much,
Hold on,
Mr.
members, please.
Deputy Speaker. Firstly, the Housing Development Corporation is a statutory authority. It is not a state enterprise. It has its own rules according to statute, and the Housing Development Corporation does have the authority to determine its own contractual affairs.
Supplemental, Naparimo.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker.
One second. Member for Oropouche East. All right. I did not say anything earlier, but please. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. To the Prime Minister, is it the intention of your government to change this policy so that the requisite oversight will be maintained over contracts of this magnitude, and that the shareholder, as final resort, will not incur significant sovereign debt?
I will not entertain this question. Supplemental, Barataria Sanwan.
Honourable Prime Minister, based on your last response, could you indicate to me whether the regional health authorities will be afforded the same type of authority that the HSD has, since they are both the same statutory bodies?
I will not entertain that question. Member for Naparimo.
Could the acting Prime Minister state what evidence at all, subsequent to the decision of the board of the Housing Development Corporation, to explain the recent termination of the contract?
Acting Prime Minister.
As far as I'm aware, that matter was already dealt with by the substantive Prime Minister at a press conference.
Member for Chaguanas West.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. Honourable Acting Prime Minister, could you explain, having regard to your statement earlier, that the HST is a statutory corporation, how do you reconcile that statement, and therefore it is entitled to its own legal approach, with the framework agreement coming before Cabinet for its approval?
Acting Prime Minister.
I think the answer to that, Mr. Deputy Speaker, is self-evident. The framework agreement came before the Cabinet. That is a fact. And the question of the detailed contract is a matter for the Housing Development Corporation in accordance with the framework agreement.
Correct.
Question number 6, member for Naparimo.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. Given that the Prime Minister is currently in Washington, D.C. for a meeting with members of the U.S. Congress, can the acting Prime Minister indicate whether the Prime Minister will be attending the 74th UN General Assembly meeting that commences on September the 17th, 2019?
Acting Prime Minister.
Yes.
Supplemental, Naparimo.
Thank you. Given that the substantive Prime Minister has missed 4 UNGAs during his tenure as Prime Minister, what new considerations informed his decision to attend this year's meeting?
Acting Prime Minister.
It was considered appropriate.
Supplemental.
Could the acting Prime Minister indicate why it was considered appropriate?
Acting Prime Minister. Please, members, please. Go ahead, Acting Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. Because of matters of national importance.
Supplemental, Naparimo.
As far as you're aware, will the substantive Prime Minister be holding bilateral meetings with other heads of governments, with whom, and what issues will be discussed?
Acting Prime Minister.
Mr. Deputy Speaker, I am not privy to those details, but it is quite normal and natural when heads of state and heads of government go to these international meetings and meet in these international forums that there would be discussions of a mutually beneficial nature.
That's the end.